My name is Ev Smith, and I'm from Wilmington, North Carolina. And the reason that I'm here, the reason that I have volunteered to help with this effort on behalf of this marvelous building that you are so fortunate to have in this community, is that in my hometown, we have a twin to this building. This is a World War II picture of it right here. You can see how closely they resemble each other. 20 years ago, this building was endangered, just as yours is. We had an element on our city council that wanted to tear it down. And just as in this community, what began as a relatively small movement of people who were convinced that this building was a resource that our city could not afford to lose. These people formed a support group to agitate on behalf of its preservation. It took us many years to do this, but over the course of a several-year period, we managed to convince not only our own civic council, city council, but the larger community, that this was a building that was well worth the investment in order to save it. So what I want to do this evening is first to share with you a little bit about the history and background of these buildings. It's a good bit more complex than you probably realized. And I'd like to talk a bit about their function during World War II, why they are important from an historical perspective. And then in the second half of my presentation, I would like to share with you some stories of other communities that have these buildings, not just my own, and the preservation efforts that are associated with them. We should have time for questions and answers afterwards. And I'm well aware that your time is very valuable, especially on a weekend. So I do thank you for turning out this evening. And without further ado, we can get started. Most of you probably associate the beginning of World War II with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, right? In fact, World War II began several years before this. Japanese aggression in the Pacific began in the early 1930s, and the war in Europe began in 1939 when Adolf Hitler attacked Poland, and England and France declared war on Germany. So there was plenty of advance warning to the United States that trouble was on the way. Americans were not united about what to do about the situation in Europe and the Pacific until after the Japanese attacked and united the nation. But beginning in 1940 and 1941, there was a substantial preparedness effort in this country. All of a sudden, defense industries were ramping up, hiring thousands of new workers, government contracts for all kinds of equipment, all kinds of military wares of every kind. The military was expanding rapidly. New military bases were being established, seemingly springing up out of the ground overnight. And the impact of this preparedness effort was the greatest on small communities like Newton Falls, because these were communities that were completely unprepared for the sudden expansion of military bases or industrial capacity in their midst. And if you're familiar with the history of this community, that in fact is what happened to Newton Falls. The population almost doubled during the war. And there were trailer camps, provisional housing was put up. Everything had to be done improvised to handle the thousands of defense workers that were working at the arsenal primarily, but were also assigned to the military bases nearby. All of a sudden, you had thousands of soldiers looking for rest and recreation on weekends, and something had to be done about it. Well, fortunately, a new organization had been established for precisely that purpose. It was called the United Service Organizations, or the USO, and it was created in February of 1941 That's 10 months before Pearl Harbor. And as originally constituted, it was an interfaith agency that was also a public-private partnership in which 6 charitable agencies pooled their military outreach efforts to provide social services and recreation to the military and defense community. And those original 6 agencies were the YMCA, the National Catholic Community Service, the National Jewish Welfare Board, the Young Women's Christian Association, the Salvation Army, and the National Travelers Aid Association. Now, eventually, all of those agencies withdrew from the USO, and the USO, which is still very much in existence today, became a standalone nonprofit organization. But originally, it is a pioneering interfaith agency, and its purpose was, as its mission statement read, to serve the religious, spiritual, welfare, and educational needs in the armed forces and defense industries, and to contribute to the morale of the defense forces in the communities in which they are located. The president of the USO in World War II was a man named, very prominent businessman named Chester Barnard. In order to accomplish its very ambitious goals, the USO established partnerships. The national organizations that composed it provided trained leaders, social workers, people who were trained in all kinds of community work to lead its programs. The local communities, like your own, provided the volunteers and the operating funds. And the federal government underwrote the building program that was needed for facilities and furnishings. A lot of different kinds of buildings were renovated during World War II for use as USO clubs. There were private homes, former businesses of every kind, commercial buildings, but there was also a federal government building program to provide larger centers for the communities in which there was a perception of need. And this building program was focused on smaller cities and towns, like this one. The federal government's part of the cost-sharing agreement was run by the Federal Security Agency, the FSA. This was an agency that had appeared in the late 1930s in order to handle all of the new social programs that were coming out under the New Deal. The best known of the programs that it administered was Social Security. And today, that agency still exists. It's evolved and expanded many times. It's now known as the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. This is its predecessor. And its leader during World War II was a former governor of Indiana named Paul McNutt. The Army was also involved in the program. In fact, the actual details of the construction of these buildings was delegated to the constructing quartermaster department of the United States Army. Now, the Army was very rapidly expanding and changing during this period, and while this project was underway, in the latter part of 1941, the constructing quartermaster department was absorbed into the United States Army Corps of Engineers. Therefore, it's proper to say both that these buildings were built by the quartermaster department and that they were built by the Corps of Engineers. The head of the constructing quartermaster department was at that time a brigadier general named Brehon Somervell, who is one of the most important generals of World War II that you have never heard of, because he rose during this period to command of what eventually became known as the Army Service Forces. At the end of the war, he was a lieutenant general, and the Army Service Forces was the component of the Army that kept every member of the United States Army equipped, fed, housed, transported, clothed, and armed throughout the war. That's 15 million men and women who were in the military at this time. When the USO project crossed his desk, General Somervell made a promise to President Franklin Roosevelt. He promised the president that he would deliver these buildings to the president as a Christmas present in 1941. Construction on these buildings began, in most cases, in September or October of 1941. They were finished by December 25th. That's how fast the government was moving in those days. The architects of these buildings were a very prominent New York City architectural firm run by Eli Jacques Kahn and Robert Allen Jacobs. This is Mr. Kahn right here and Mr. Jacobs on the right. Eli Jacques Kahn was best known as one of the people who shaped the skyline of New York City in the 1920s. He built skyscrapers in the Art Deco style. And of all the skyscrapers that he built at that time, they're all still standing, and every one of them is considered a landmark today. So he is regarded as a very important commercial architect in New York City. Robert Allen Jacobs was a relative newcomer to his firm, but had been hired because he had been a protege. He had trained in Paris under an architect named Le Corbusier. And for anybody who knows anything about architecture, Le Corbusier is usually considered the most important architect of the 20th century. And Jacobs was one of his proteges. Le Corbusier is usually given credit for having founded an entire school of architecture called the International Style. And so it was Jacobs who brought that influence into the firm of Kahn and Jacobs. And as we shall see, that is the architectural style that was reflected in their building program. There was also a younger architect involved in this building project, and his name was André Ramondet. He was a young Frenchman, obviously enough, training with Kahn and Jacobs in New York City the same way that Jacobs had trained with a French architect in Paris. And after the war, during the war, I should say first, he served with General Patton's army. And then after the war, he returned to France, and he eventually became the director of the École Nationale Supérieure des Beaux-Arts, the famous College of Beaux-Arts in Paris. He also became the chief architect of public buildings in Paris, and if any of you have heard of the modern visionary architect named Frank Gehry, Frank Gehry got his start apprenticing with Ramondet. So you've got a very, very distinguished architectural team that is responsible for these buildings. Because of the Army's involvement in the construction program, a lot of people got the impression that the Army designed these buildings, and therefore that they had no more architectural distinction than a barracks or a mess hall. But that is not true. A very prominent architectural firm, very prominent architects were involved in the creation of these buildings. They are significant nationally from an architectural standpoint as well as a historical standpoint. This is André Ramondet's original conceptual drawing for your building, and all of the buildings that matched it in style, like the one that we have in Wilmington. It was officially known as a Type A Federal Recreation Building. And you can see from the illustration how closely the finished buildings resembled yours. The only real distinction in your building that has been changed over the years is that in the original design here, as you can see, there was a flat roof over the lobby area in front of the auditorium. That is architecturally known as a cantilevered roof. And unfortunately, flat roofs are not very practical in the kind of climate that you have here in Ohio. So a practical decision was made over the years to put a sloped roof or pitched roof over the auditorium. But other than that, you can see how closely the buildings resemble the architect's original concept. And these are very, very advanced designs for 1941. They are in the international style, which becomes the default architectural style of the second half of the 20th century. Practically every modern skyscraper, commercial building, large building of any kind reflects the international style and design features that were pioneering back in the 1940s. For example, notice the ribbon windows, that's what they're called, on the wings. That's a design feature that Le Corbusier introduced into his architecture. He was the one who is responsible for that. The purpose is to provide a panorama of what is outside. And if you're in that building looking out the windows, you do indeed get a panorama as you're looking out the windows of the wings, which are continuous. These floor-to-ceiling windows right here on the front of the building are the ancestors of the curtain windows that nowadays sheathe just about every building that you can think of. Those wall-to-ceiling glass windows, those are called curtain windows. And there's the ancestor of them right there. Furthermore, by introducing a cantilevered roof into their design, inside the lobby, there are pillars that support the roof. And that has an architectural purpose because those pillars are there for the purpose of eliminating load-bearing walls inside the building. Prior to the introduction of that kind of design feature, every interior building had to have these big masonry, brick, concrete walls to support the load of the roof. By putting the pillars into those areas, then that was eliminated, and that enabled what nowadays we refer to as the open floor plan, which is typical of just about every building, every workplace, an open workspace with pillars and with interior partitions that can be adjusted, changed around, taken out, moved, without having to worry about affecting the structure of the building. But unless at some point this was changed, all of the interior walls in your building are made of plywood. We think of plywood as being a very inferior building substance, very cheap. But in World War II, airplanes were built out of plywood. Plywood is actually much stronger than regular wood. But it is also light and capable of being moved around and adjusted. And so all of the interior walls in your building were made that way so that they could be moved, that you could reconfigure the interior of this building in any way that you wanted to do. So, again, to repeat, this is a very, very advanced idea for 1941. This little structure right here, by the way, is not the auditorium. A lot of these buildings had second stories. They were designed that way so that you could put a second story on them if you wanted to. Your building doesn't have that feature, but many buildings did. The other thing I might want to mention is that the auditorium of your building and all other buildings like it has a pitched roof, a peaked roof. And ordinarily, that is not considered to be a feature of the international style of architecture. The flat roof is pretty typical of those buildings. And so when I first started in Wilmington pointing out that this building was built in the international style, people were saying, who knew something about architecture and were very good at knowing something about architecture, they said, that building's got a peaked roof, a pitched roof. It can't possibly be international. But the auditorium was designed from the beginning for a specific purpose. It was intended to be a dance hall. That stage at the back of your auditorium is exactly the right size for a big band, one of the swing era bands that were so popular back in the 1940s. And if you're going to use a space as a dance hall, you can't have pillars on it. Therefore, you had to put a peaked roof onto that part of the building. But that's okay, because one of the principal concepts that went along with the international style was the idea that form follows function. The architecture of a building should reflect the purpose for which it is designed. And so therefore, far from being a disqualifying factor, the pitched roof is a perfect example of the design philosophy of the international style that motivated these buildings. And I'm willing to bet none of you had any idea of this. Your building is called a Type A, but there are 3 other, total of 4, styles of federal recreation building, to use their formal title. This is the Type B. The main difference between your building and the Type B is that the Type B building was L-shaped. It has a larger footprint than your building does, and it is more efficient because you can enter the auditorium or the lobby area independently, whereas in the Type A building, if you're going to get into the auditorium, you have to walk through the lobby, which can be a problem if you've got programs going on there. Use that one. Okay, Type C. Type C is the same floor plan design as the Type B, but as you can tell, this is a bigger, it is a more elaborate looking building. It's constructed out of brick rather than wood. Incidentally, another misconception that you might have had is that these buildings were designed to be temporary, and they were not. The cost of your building was about $75,000, excluding the money that was paid for the land on which it stands. And if you take that sum of money and translate it into modern purchasing terms, it's about the equivalent of $1.3 million. So these buildings were designed to be permanent assets to their community long after the war was over. Final style, Type D. The Type D is very similar in appearance to the Type A, except it is smaller. The lobby is not quite as large. And the most likely reason for that was that it could be built a little bit less expensively, or it was designed to be built on lots that were slightly smaller. The USO buildings were very heavily utilized during the war. Your building is quite special because it was specifically designed for defense workers, the people who were working at the arsenal. The great majority of USO clubs were designed for servicemen or servicewomen. But if you take the uniforms out of this picture and substitute civilian dress for defense workers, you've probably got a pretty good idea of what your all's auditorium looked like on a typical Saturday night. These buildings were kept open 24 hours a day by the local community volunteers, including many of the adults in the community and large numbers of young women. This is a photograph from my own club in Wilmington, showing hostesses rehearsing Christmas carols in advance of a hospital visit in 1945. They went to the hospital to provide some cheer for the servicemen who were sick or injured in them. And as that fact indicates, these young women were far more than dance partners for soldiers at dances. By the end of the war in Wilmington, there were young women who had racked up a total of 4,000 hours of service to the USO during the war. And if you do the math, that works out to 10 hours of commitment per week, every week, for 4 years. I'm not going to go through all of this information here. I put in this slide just to show you the vast range of activities that USO clubs offered. They would have varied here because they were aimed at defense workers and their families, but many of them would have been the same regardless of where you were in the United States. Not just recreation programs, not just dances and entertainment, but social services. A young mother who was the wife of a defense worker could go to the USO building, drop off her child, and have someone babysit for her for several hours while she ran errands or did her shopping. In Wilmington, which is a coastal community, the hostesses took the children who lived in the trailer parks and gave them outings at the beach. This is typical of what went on in every USO club and gives you an example of what yours did and what every other club in the United States did at the same time. Okay, then and now. At the end of 1941, the USO's financial report stated that there were 201 of these clubs in existence. in the 4 styles of buildings that we have just made note of. That's not the total number of USO clubs around the nation, but it is the total of the number of buildings that existed at that time. I don't know, and I have never been able to find out, how many were added in 1942 and 1943. I don't think there were too many of them. I think we can accept that in all likelihood there were less than 300 of these buildings built around the nation, which works out to an average of 4 or 5 per state in the 48 states of the United States at that time. How many of them are left? Well, I've been tracking them for 20 years, and the total number that I can confirm still standing and still in existence at this time is 14. Of the type A building, the type that you all have, I can confirm 4. Yours, which is the only building left in Ohio, my building in Wilmington, another building in North Carolina, and a 4th one in Texas. When I was doing the research for this presentation, I thought I had reliable information about a 5th building, but I tried every which way to identify it online, and I couldn't. So I've taken that building off the list. I'm quite certain that there are others out there, but they're flying beneath the radar screen historically at this point, which isn't to say that they are not historic buildings, but simply that there are a lot of communities like this one where the historical significance of the building hasn't been appreciated. So 4 type A's, 1 type B, 1 type C, and the type D, which was the smallest building, is a little bit more common. I've found 8 of those at the present time. Here's our building in Wilmington. It was identified as an historic building as early as 1962, when it was incorporated into a local historic district. And as the concept of preservation expanded in Wilmington, it was added to state and to National Register historic districts as well. National Register Historic District is an area of historic buildings, and the USO building is defined as a contributing building, which means what the name says. It adds to the historical significance of that area. That didn't prevent it from becoming the targets of 3 efforts on the part of our city council to get rid of it. And the group of which I was a part had to work for the better part of 10 years to convince those opponents that that building deserved to be renovated. But that finally happened. It was renovated 10 years ago, beautifully and completely, as you can see it here. And the wisdom of that decision has been obvious every day since that time. The demand for that building is so great that it can't stay open long enough to meet the demand for it. It is a true community center and a building that turned out to be just as irreplaceable as our community thought that it was. The movement to save our building transcended generations. Here we have a picture of a group of young ladies at the local high school who put on a fundraiser for it. They did a professional quality variety show with songs and dancing and entertainment and catered food, all done with volunteer effort as a senior project by the local high school. And the result was every bit as worthy as what any professional nonprofit could have done. Here we have the other end of the age spectrum. 20 years ago, of course, World War veterans were far more numerous than they are today, but we had any number of events that commemorated their contribution and honored their service to their country. And since the building was renovated, it has become the locus of cultural arts programs of all kinds: theater, performing arts, fine arts, painting, sculpture, pottery. There's a children's theater organization there, and here we have auditions for The Little Mermaid just last year. This is typical of the kind of usage that our community has found for this building. Now, I have been involved in a couple of other preservation campaigns since the one in Wilmington. In the year 2004, the one remaining building in Hawthorne, Nevada was listed by the state on its list of the 10 most endangered historic sites in the state of Nevada. Hawthorne, you will notice, is a community of 3,270 people, quite comparable to Newton Falls. I was contacted at that time by the state preservation officer who was having difficulty creating an application to put this building on the National Register of Historic Places. And I was able to provide her with some of the same information that I have provided to you this evening. And the outcome was a successful nomination, which the state preservation officer, that lady, was kind enough to say that she owed to me. Subsequently, with its listing as an endangered building and its recognition as an historic structure, the local county removed it from the list of intended demolitions. That building, too, was renovated, and it is now the town convention hall. Another project that I was involved in a small way, was in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where their African-American USO building, these buildings date back to a period of segregation in the United States, and there are only 2 of them that are left standing that were used by the African-American community. One of those buildings was in Hattiesburg, and it was under renovation to become the National African American Military Museum. I was contacted by the architectural firm which wanted information about how to restore the exterior of this building to its original appearance. I was able to provide them with that information. A small role, and certainly I was not decisive in any way in this regard, but here again, a building that has been transformed into a very important hall of history and honor with regard to military service in our country. And I thought also I would just throw in a few slides here towards the end with regard to some other communities, including some that are very comparable to you all in size, that have also found it possible to make a commitment to these buildings and to see to it that they are renovated and that their legacy is perpetuated. Jamestown, Rhode Island, which has a population of 5,400, renovated its building about 15 years ago, as the town recreation center. Bowling Green, Virginia is a community of just over 1,000 people. And its USO building has been in use as the town hall and event center since the late 1940s, and it is still the hub of community activities. This happens to be a building that I visited personally, so I can attest firsthand to the affection in which the community holds it. And in Marfa, Texas, a community that has less than 2,000 people, according to the last census returns, they have renovated their building as the town convention center and event hall. And if you notice here in the background, they've managed to include photographs of every person in their community who has served in the military. Is that the final slide? Or do I have one more? Okay, that's it. Well, for concluding remarks, the reason we preserve historic buildings is because they are the fabric of our communities. They are what makes our communities communities. They are the continuity that we pass down from one generation to the next. They enable the future to learn from the past, and they bring their communities together. And that is what these buildings have been doing ever since they were built. The men and women of the greatest generation were not just fighting to defend their country, they were fighting to defend the values that it represented, which included the values of home and community and family. And these buildings perpetuate and preserve that legacy today. And that is why I wish you all the best in your effort to make sure that that legacy is not lost. Thank you very much.